Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary bedrooms of medieval royalty, where power, lust, and absolutely no concept of boundaries collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. King John of England, also known as John Lackland, and informally the worst dinner guest in British history, is best remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow still finding time to be wildly inappropriate with most of the nobility's daughters. John's reign, 1199 to 1216, was a masterclass in how not to behave in public office. Politically, a disaster. Personally, somehow worse. John didn't just take lovers, he took them. He was notorious for kidnapping noblewomen, imprisoning them in royal castles, and entertaining them until they were either married off elsewhere or conveniently forgotten. His favorite technique for breaking up powerful families wasn't battle. It was seducing the wife, alienating the husband, and then charging him double taxes. Efficient chroniclers were so uncomfortable with John's behavior that even biased medieval scribes, people who routinely ignored witch trials and floggings, wrote things like he was not temperate with women and he did not abstain from wives and daughters. That's medieval, for he made the Christmas party deeply awkward. At one point, John reportedly had 30 mistresses on official record. That's not romantic. That's a staffing issue. Several nobles complained directly to the crown that John was abusing their hospitality, which is a polite way of saying he slept with everyone, including the serving staff and possibly the family goat. His behavior was so bad it nearly started a rebellion, not because of taxation or war, but because half the baronses were afraid to leave their wives unattended during royal visits. One baron refused to meet John unless his entire household was locked up first. That's diplomacy, 13th century style. And yet, in true royal fashion, John never saw a problem. He considered himself irresistible. There's no evidence for this outside of his own letters. But when you're king, delusion comes standard. In the end, King John left behind a kingdom in turmoil, a legacy of distrust, and possibly several children no one talked about at court. He was the kind of king who made people invent democracy just to keep them away from their families. Not the worst monarch in history, but definitely the one you'd never let babysit. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422. And yes, that nickname was earned, not given lightly at a drunken banquet. Began his reign with promise. Young, handsome, capable. Then things took a turn. He started forgetting who he was, attacking his own knights, and at one point believed he was made of glass, insisting his servants wrap him in blankets so he wouldn't shatter while walking. Not exactly the image of kingly strength, but impressive in terms of creative paranoia. Now, most kings who believe they are fragile glass figurines usually avoid scandal. Not Charles. He somehow managed to juggle a royal mistress, a paranoid delusion, and civil war all at once. A multitasker, his long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to manage the court, while Charles did things like run screaming from mirrors and refused to bathe for fear the water might dissolve him. Meanwhile, his mistress Odette de Sam was quietly moved into the palace, introduced to everyone as his comfort, which was medieval code for don't ask questions, just smile. Odette, for her part, stayed with Charles during his most unhinged years. She must have had the patience of a saint or the property rights of a queen. She reportedly brushed his hair, listened to his glass-spaced ramblings, and helped him put on multiple layers of padded clothes so he could sit down safely. Nothing says passion like strapping your royal lover into a pillow suit. But Charles wasn't just eccentric behind closed doors. He also hosted court entertainments where things went horribly wrong. During one infamous event known as the Bal d'Ierden, he He and his friends dressed as wild men in flammable costumes and danced around with torches. Naturally, someone dropped a flame and several of them burned alive. Charles survived, but his dignity did not. Despite everything, Charles fathered 12 children, several during episodes of apparent lucidity, or at least enough lucidity. Royal chronicles don't clarify whether he remembered their names, but one can assume that naming a child not made of glass was discouraged. Charles VI ruled France into ruin, but more impressively, he managed to make mental illness, royal scandal, and medieval pyrotechnics all part of the same tragicomic package, and somehow they still let him wear a crown. Peter the Cruel, also known as Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were with him or under a floorboard because of him, ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369. His idea of romance was a curious blend of royal charm, obsessive jealousy, and the occasional politically inconvenient murder. His early love life wasn't exactly Shakespearean. He fell for a noblewoman named Maria di Padella, whom he may or may not have married in secret. The secrecy part is key, mostly because he was also being married off to other women for alliances, which made things slightly awkward. One of those women was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman he married, then locked in a castle 3 days later. She spent the rest of her life in prison because Peter decided Maria had prettier hair. Or maybe he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Either way, it was an aggressive form of ghosting. Maria, meanwhile, became his lifelong obsession. Even when he married other women, she remained his favorite. When she died, Peter reportedly wept for days and then ordered that she be declared his legal wife, retroactively, just to confuse everyone and possibly to justify the fact that she had already given birth to 4 of his children. But Peter's passions didn't stop at unannounced annulments and royal kidnapping. He was known for falling in love violently, which is not poetic. It's just dangerous. One of his mistresses, Donna Juana, tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, as with several of his political enemies and cousins, and occasionally people who made eye contact at the wrong moment. Contemporary accounts mention that Peter sometimes watched executions from his balcony while lounging with a mistress. That's not charming sociopath. That's HBO villain with poor impulse control. But even with all the drama, the Castilian court was never boring. Gossip flowed faster than wine, and Peter's relationships blurred the line between passion and vendetta. His idea of romantic gestures included surprise weddings, surprise divorces, and the occasional surprise stabbing. Eventually, Peter was killed by his own half-brother in a rather symbolic act of family therapy. But his reputation as one of Europe's most aggressively unromantic romantics lives on. If love is a battlefield, Peter brought siege equipment. Edward II of England ruled from 137 to 1327 and is best remembered for 2 things: losing to the Scots at Bannockbourne and showing more affection to his male favorites than to his actual queen. One of those things was considered treason. The other was considered controversial dinner conversation. Let's begin with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion, rumored lover, and full-time fashion icon. Piers wasn't just close to Edward. He was elevated to positions of ridiculous influence, gifted estates, titles, and jewelry that frankly matched none of his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers wore more sparkle than the royal regalia and upstaged the Queen, which is a bold move when your survival depends on nobles not hating you. Spoiler, they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was understandably furious. She came with political expectations and a generous dowry, neither of which included sharing the throne with her husband's bestie, possible boyfriend. Edward, however, remained devoted. When the nobles demanded Piers be exiled, Edward sulked, sent him away, then brought him right back, like a teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the Baronses had enough and executed Piers. Edward was devastated. Think full and royal meltdown, mourning clothes, public weeping, the whole medieval soap opera. His grief, however, did not lead to self-reflection. It just made room for a new favorite. Hugh Despenser, the younger. Hugh made Piers look like a subtle footnote. He wasn't just Edward's advisor. He was basically the second king. Land, titles, entire counties, you got them. The rest of the nobility got angry. Isabella, by this point, switched from annoyed wife to full-blown vengeance avatar. She teamed up with a lover of her own. Edward's enemy naturally invaded England and overthrew her husband. Edward was imprisoned, stripped of his crown, and possibly murdered by red-hot poker. Yes, that rumor exists. No, we're not discussing the physics of it. Let's just say medieval revenge was rarely subtle. Edward II's reign was less about governance and more about personal drama, so intense it could be a reality show. If the Plantagenets had Netflix, his season would have been banned in 3 countries. His mistake, mixing politics with passion, ignoring everyone else, and assuming royal power meant nobody could touch him. Turns out, everyone could eventually. Wazlos of Bohemia ruled in the late 14th century. Though ruled might be a generous term, he technically held titles like King of the Romans and King of Bohemia. But his real achievements were more along the lines of public nudity, aggressive drinking, and starting fights in his own palace. If you're thinking of good King West from the Christmas Carol, wrong guy. That was his ancestor. This Weslaus, not good, not even vaguely decent. He began with promise, crowned as a teenager, intelligent, multilingual, and capable. But somewhere along the way, he decided the royal wine cellar was more useful than the treasury and started governing from the bottom of a goblet. Weslaus developed a reputation for hosting multi-day drinking sessions where policy decisions were made between rounds of mead and inappropriate limericks. His advisors began carrying flasks, not to drink, but to survive negotiations. At court, debates often ended with someone flipping a table or being challenged to a duel using breadsticks. He also developed the charming habit of streaking through the castle, sometimes mid-meeting. One chronicler records Weslaus delivering royal edicts completely naked, except for a sword belt. His justification: clothes are for the timid. Hard to argue with that kind of logic when the guy with the crown also has a long sword and no pants. Romantically, he favored barmaids, laundresses, and occasionally, nobles' wives, though he seemed more invested in their beer recommendations than their feelings. Affairs weren't scandalous at his court. They were practically job interviews. One noble accused him of seducing his sister. Weslaus shrugged and offered him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they'd had enough of his royal vodka and removed him as king of the Romans. A polite way of saying, "You're fired," but we're pretending it's political. Even his own brother called him useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Still, Weslaus somehow reigned in Bohemia for decades. His people tolerated him the way one tolerates a loud uncle at a wedding, with eye rolls, careful seating plans, and lots of alcohol. In the end, he left behind a shaky kingdom, a flooded wine cellar, and a royal legacy, best summed up as he ruled like every day was his last hangover. Henry VIII of England is what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked hormones. He ruled from 159 to 1547 and spent most of it either getting married, getting divorced, or getting mad at the Pope for not supporting his questionable dating decisions. You've heard the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that barely scratches the surface of Henry's royal rom-com turned horror series. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, wife number 1. After 20 years of marriage, Henry decided God was mad at him for not having a male heir. Naturally, the solution wasn't introspection. It was annulment, excommunication, and the creation of an entirely new church. He invented Anglicanism just to date someone else. That's not devotion. That's pettiness with a cathedral. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Henry wrote her love letters full of passion, obsession, and really bad poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, but no sons. This led to her arrest for adultery, witchcraft, and possibly giving side at court. She was beheaded. Henry moved on with the emotional reign of a potato. Jane Seymour followed, producing a male heir, Edward, before tragically dying from childbirth complications. Henry mourned her deeply, by which we mean he waited a respectful 11 days before scoping out wife number 4. Next came Anne of Cleves, who Henry chose based on a flattering portrait. In person, he said she looked like a Flanders mare. That marriage lasted 6 months and ended in what we'd now call a no-fault divorce and a politely written Yelp review. Catherine Howard, wife number 5, was much younger and considerably less discreet. She was executed for adultery, though honestly, it's hard to blame her. Being married to Henry at that point meant dealing with gout, paranoia, and a man who could barely walk, but still insisted he was a gift to women. Finally, Catherine Parr, wife 6, who wisely outlived him by being literate, patient, and excellent at dodging accusations. By the time Henry died, he'd bankrupted England, eaten half its livestock, and turned the royal court into a soap opera where heads rolled more often than wedding bands. In short, Henry VIII loved hard, ruled harder, and left a trail of drama so legendary it's still being turned into musicals. Francis I of France, ruling from 1515 to 1547, was the walking embodiment of the Renaissance. Cultured, charming, sophisticated, and absolutely incapable of keeping his trousers buttoned. To his credit, he was a great patron of the arts. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built magnificent palaces, and helped turn France into a cultural powerhouse. But while the painters were painting and the poets were poeting, Francis was busy seducing anything with a pulse and a title. His court was famous, or perhaps infamous, for its opulence, but also for being a kind of state-funded dating app. He employed gentlewomen of the bed chamber, a term that should have meant ladies-in-waiting, but really meant romantic shortlist. Entire political alliances were derailed because Francis accidentally bedded the ambassador's wife. And this wasn't quiet, subtle adultery. Francis was loud about it. He once declared to foreign dignitaries that French kings were expected to be excellent lovers, which is noble sounding until you realize it came from a man who treated treaties and mistresses with the same level of commitment, which is to say temporary. His most famous affair was with Françoise de Voir, a noble woman who became his official mistress. She was witty, educated, and likely the only woman who could roast him in public and survive. Eventually replaced because of course she was followed by Anne Dessel de Haley, a woman whose name sounds like a medieval inside joke and whose political influence was matched only by her ability to outlast the competition. Even his enemies couldn't help but notice. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once described Francis as more dangerous in the bedroom than on the battlefield. He meant it as an insult. Francis probably took it as a compliment, and somehow, amid the affairs, banquets, and what can only be described as diplomatic flirtation, Francis still managed to rule effectively, though his wars were expensive, and his taste in women even more so. The man was nothing if not enthusiastic. His reign was a whirlwind of silk, scandal, and second-hand perfume. Francis I wasn't just a king. He was France's most seductive historical liability. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Alonso, the 11th of Castile, ruled from 1311 to 1350, and he had one major hobby besides ruling a kingdom: ignoring his wife in the most public, extravagant way possible. His poor, politically strategic wife was Maria of Portugal, noble, well-connected, and unfortunately not Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alonso actually cared about. Leonor was a Castilian noblewoman with a sharp mind, 11 children, and enough influence to basically run the court herself. And unlike Maria, she didn't need a crown to feel important. She just needed Alonso's complete and shameless obsession. Now, most kings had mistresses. Alonso turned his into a shadow queen. He built Leonor palaces, gave her land, took her everywhere. Meanwhile, Queen Maria was left sitting alone at royal events like an unwanted centerpiece, while Alonso made googly eyes across the hall at his side chick, who was not even trying to be subtle about it. To make matters worse, or better, depending on your tolerance for medieval soap operas, Leonor wasn't just a mistress. She was politically active, negotiating treaties, commanding respect, and producing heirs like it was her full-time job, which, let's be honest, it kind of was. Alfonso refused to even pretend Maria mattered. In fact, he only spent time with her once, and it was purely for diplomatic optics. After that, he retreated to Leonor's estate, like a man allergic to marital obligations. This didn't sit well with Maria's dad, who happened to be the King of Portugal. At one point, international relations got so tense over the whole situation that a war nearly broke out. Imagine your in-laws being so mad about your mistress, they consider military retaliation. But Alonso didn't care. He continued, parading Leonor around court like a royal trophy, and probably would have kept it up forever if the Black Death hadn't killed him in 1350. That's right, it took a literal plague to end his affair. After Alonso died, Queen Maria finally had her moment. She had Leonor imprisoned and executed in a move that historians call vengeful, and most of us would call extremely fair. Alonso's reign may be remembered for military victories, but let's be real. His true legacy was being one of the most publicly whipped kings in medieval history. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, and no, not in the personality sense, ruled from 1285 to 1314. His nickname came from his good looks, which were unfortunately not matched by good behavior. Outwardly, Philip was pious, serious, and all about moral reform. Inwardly, he was running a kingdom like it was a very tense reality show, complete with betrayal, secret, trials, and a healthy dose of double standards, especially in the bedroom department. His most infamous scandal was the Tour de Nesle affair, a medieval sex scandal so messy it could have been scripted by HBO. It all started when Philip's daughter, Isabella, yes, the same one who would later overthrow Edward II of England, noticed that her sisters-in-law were being a little too friendly with some knights, suspiciously friendly, like matching gift exchange and secret tower rendezvous. Friendly, Isabella tattled to Philip, who launched a royal investigation with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Two of the princesses, married to Philip's sons, were found guilty of adultery and publicly imprisoned for years. Their heads shaved, their titles revoked, and their reputations completely annihilated. The two knights involved, tortured, flayed, and executed in the public square, because nothing says moral leadership like turning a family affair into a medieval snuff film. Now, here's where things get interesting. While Philip was handing out brutal punishments like candy, rumors swirled that he himself kept a few mistresses tucked away in private rooms of the Louvre, no less. Some whispered that he maintained a secret group of young women who were available to entertain visiting dignitaries for diplomacy, of course. But unlike his daughters-in-law, nobody ever questioned the king's private affairs, because when you're the one writing the rules, it's amazing how sin becomes strategy. Philip also had a special knack for using religion when convenient. He went after the Knights Templar for supposed heresy, but everyone knew it was about their money. It was the medieval equivalent of arresting your banker and calling it divine justice. So yes, Philip may have looked like a model of piety and honor, but behind that sculpted jawline and royal glare was a man with a deep commitment to hypocrisy and a working knowledge of where all the castle's secret doors were. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, was the kind of man who collected crowns the way other men collected wine goblets, which he also collected enthusiastically, reigning from the late 14th to mid-5th century. Sigismund was smart, multilingual, and politically savvy. He also had a personal life so scandalous it would make a tavern bard blush. To begin with, Sigismund was married to Queen Mary of Hungary, a powerful woman in her own right, but marriage to Sigismund was more of a polite formality. He preferred his relationships less lawful, more frequent, and ideally not followed by conversation. His romantic side projects included noble women, laresses, and at least one Italian opera singer long before opera existed, which speaks to his innovative spirit. Court officials often lost track of his mistresses, not because there were so many, but because they changed so frequently. Some historians suggest they just started numbering them, At court, his mistresses had their own quarters, servants, and in one case, a private chapel, which is either deeply romantic or just wildly inappropriate, depending on how you feel about praying next to someone's mistress. Sigismund also had a fondness for disguises, particularly dressing as a commoner and sneaking into towns. Sometimes it was for espionage, sometimes to flirt with local women under the guise of being a very tall merchant. Apparently, nobody found this suspicious, despite him being the only merchant with a full entourage of servants wearing royal crests. And yet the man ruled for decades, launched crusades, hosted the Council of Constance, and reformed imperial politics, all while carrying on affairs that would make even Casanova go steady on mate. One ambassador once wrote that Sigismund greets all women as equals, especially in private, which, while vaguely progressive, also sounded suspiciously like an HR violation. But despite his extracurriculars, Sigismund remained immensely popular, mostly because he managed to appear regal in public while quietly running the most chaotic love life in Europe. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a one-man renaissance, equal parts strategist, statesman, and scandal. And somehow he always got away with it. Louis XV of France, known as Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774. And by ruled, we mostly mean he hosted an endless royal after-party where governance was optional and silk bedsheets were not. He started out promising enough, young, handsome, and poised to carry on the legacy of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV. But somewhere around his 20s, Louis decided national policy could wait because he had a long list of ladies in waiting to attend to. Let's talk about the Parc aux Cerfs, the quiet little house near Versailles that Louis used for, let's call them, private auditions. Girls were recruited, usually poor but pretty, brought in discreetly, and rotated like seasonal produce. There were so many mistresses. The palace guards likely had a clipboard system. His most famous mistress, Madame Pompadour, wasn't just a pretty face. She basically ran France behind the scenes. But when she lost interest in the physical side of their relationship, Louis said that's fine, and built a second harem instead. The logic: keep Pompadour for brains and banter, keep the parquet for everything else. It was all very organized chaos. Each girl received gifts, titles, and in some cases, discreet housing once their contract expired. It was France's most unofficial but strangely efficient internship program. And the queen, Marie Leczinska, she was around somewhere, mostly ignored. Once she stopped having children, Louise treated her like antique furniture, too expensive to throw away, but no longer relevant to the room. The scandal at court was so normalized that nobles didn't ask if the king had a mistress. They asked how many this week. Even foreign ambassadors gossiped in their letters about the turnover rate at Versailles. That's not a monarchy. That's a brothel with better uniforms. Ironically, Louis genuinely thought he was a good ruler between lavish balls, discreet pregnancies, and awkward silences with his wife. His reign, while not catastrophic, set the tone for his grandson, Louis V, 16th, who would later lose his head, possibly because Grandpa spent too much time thinking with the wrong crown. In the end, Louis X, 15th left behind a debt-ridden France, a disillusioned court, and a royal reputation that could best be summarized as loved by women, loathed by accountants. Christian II of Denmark ruled from 1766 to 1808, though ruled might be too strong a word. Wobbled through life, while other people ran the country, is probably more accurate. You see, Christian had a few issues. He suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and was not particularly interested in the whole being king thing, unless it involved chasing servants with cutlery, which he, apparently, found hilarious. This made him more of a royal mascot than a monarch. Now, Christian had a wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, a sensible young woman who expected a somewhat normal marriage. What she got was a husband who preferred masturbating in public, talking to his hand, and disappearing during state dinners to ride imaginary horses down palace corridors. It's unclear what broke first, her patience or his grasp on reality. Enter Jan Friedrich Struzzi, the king's physician. Smart ambitious, and very interested in power. Struensee quickly became the real ruler of Denmark, and somewhat awkwardly, the lover of the queen. Yes, that's right. Caroline Matilda went full soap opera and began an affair with her husband's doctor, and the king did not notice or care. Struensee wrote the laws, signed the edicts, and kept Christian occupied with puppet shows, sword games, and gentle nudges away from sharp objects. It was perhaps the only love triangle in history where one corner was just vaguely humming to himself in the background. Caroline and Stry even had a child together, possibly the king's on paper, definitely not his in practice. For a while, the two ran Denmark like a very progressive, slightly scandalous think tank, but royal courts are rarely chill places. Eventually, Christian's jealous mother-in-law got wind of the affair and staged a coup. Struens was arrested, tortured, and executed quite dramatically, while Caroline was shipped off to exile with her reputation in tatters. As for Christian, he returned to being a gently supervised liability, spending the rest of his reign in a kind of padded silence. His reign is remembered less for achievements and more for the sheer absurdity of it all. A king who ruled nothing, a queen who tried her best, and a physician who tried a little too hard. History calls it a constitutional crisis. We call it Europe's weirdest love story. Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, came back from exile with one clear agenda: bring back fun, preferably with as many mistresses as humanly possible. Spoiler, mission accomplished. After surviving a civil war, hiding in oak trees, and living in continental poverty, Charles returned to England as king and promptly decided the nation needed a little less puritanism and a little more clothing-optional ballroom dancing. Parliament reluctantly agreed. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, Charles had dozens of official mistresses, and those are just the ones we know about. His most famous flame was Nell Gwyn, a sharp-tongued actress who once called herself the Protestant, just to differentiate herself from all the other mistresses. Honestly, iconic branding. Then there was Barbara Palmer, titled Countess of Castlemaine, who was less mistress and more palace fixture. She was openly kept in royal apartments and had multiple children by Charles, all of whom were granted titles and land, because nepotism is more fun when it's flirty. Charles didn't even pretend to be discreet. He brought his mistresses to court events. He paid them government pensions. He even had a corridor built at Whitehall so they could reach his bedroom without disturbing the ambassador's efficiency. Thy name is Charles. Queen Catherine of Banza, his long-suffering wife, endured it all with quiet dignity and possibly a flask. She bore no children, and Charles reportedly said, "She could not bear children, but she never gave me trouble," which is both a compliment and a red flag. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children and acknowledged most of them, giving them noble titles and throwing elaborate birthday parties. Meanwhile, the legitimate line remained childless, as if karma had a sense of humor. Despite the scandals, Charles was popular. He reopened theaters, legalized fun, and restored monarchy with flair, wigs, and more eyeliner than his actresses. The people forgave him everything, mostly because he made monarchy look like a party. When he died, his final words were, "Let not poor Nelly starve, not God bless England, not tell my brother to rule wisely, just feed the mistress." And that, friends, sums up Charles II, a king who governed like he was hosting a royal bachelor season finale. Eric I, 14th of Sweden, ruled from 1560 to 1568, a short reign, but long enough to leave behind a legacy of paranoia, poetry, and utterly catastrophic dating choices. Now Eric started out promising, tall, handsome, fond of astronomy and the arts, the kind of king who might write you a love sonnet and then explain planetary orbits over dinner. He was also obsessed with astrology, so he rarely made decisions without checking the stars first. Unfortunately, the stars never told him to chill. Eric had a thing for noble women, but not in the subtle whisper in a garden kind of way. He proposed to Queen Elizabeth I, one of England, multiple times, and she repeatedly declined, politely, then firmly, then with complete silence. Eric didn't get the hint and even sent portraits of himself as gifts, which is the 16th century equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs with a shirtless selfie and a marriage contract. After Elizabeth ghosted him, Eric set his sights lower in rank, not enthusiasm. He fell for Karen Munn's daughter, a commoner and the daughter of a jailer. This scandalized the nobility, which only made Eric dig in harder. He married her, crowned her queen, and then spent the next year having emotional breakdowns, imprisoning nobles, and stabbing people he thought looked at her funny. His most infamous moment, the Stuart murders, a casual dinner party, that ended with Eric personally killing a noble with a knife while shouting things that made his courtiers question whether astrology had finally broken his brain. By this point, he was hearing voices, hiding from invisible enemies, and occasionally dressing in disguise to spy on his own council. The nobility staged an intervention, which in royal terms means they locked him in a castle and handed the crown to his brother. Eric spent the rest of his life imprisoned, writing bizarre love poetry to Karen, occasionally ranting about conspiracies, and probably regretting stabbing that guy mid-supper. Sweden learned a few things from Eric's reign. Always check your dinner guests for hidden blades. Avoid kings who write their own horoscopes. And maybe, just maybe, don't crown the man who insists the moon is whispering about betrayal. Ferdinand I of Naples, also known as Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled from the mid-5th century and brought with him a rare blend of charm, brutality, and a hobby that would make most people cancel dinner plans immediately. On the surface, Ferdinand was a cultured and efficient ruler. He stabilized his kingdom, balanced the budget, and crushed rebellions with impressive speed. But his leadership style leaned heavily into friendly dictator with a side of psychological warfare. Case in point, his approach to enemies. Most kings exiled traitors. Some imprisoned them. Ferdinand, he preferred to stuff them. Yes, taxidermy of humans. After executing rebellious nobles, he had them embalmed and displayed in a private museum underneath his castle. It was called the Black Room, and he gave guided tours to foreign dignitaries, visiting ambassadors, and even potential traitors. Nothing says behave yourself like showing someone your haul of preserved political mistakes. He reportedly enjoyed describing each corpse by name, crime, and expression. Some were posed mid-scream, others had plaques. One guest fainted. Ferdinand found it hilarious. If TripAdvisor had existed, the reviews would have been 5 stars, deeply unsettling, would not return without sedative. Now, when he wasn't curating the creepiest gallery in Europe, Ferdinand had an equally questionable romantic reputation. He fathered numerous illegitimate children, many of whom mysteriously popped up with titles and land. His official queen was just one lady among many, and it's suspected that Ferdinand saw marriage as more of a suggestion than a rule. His mistresses ranged from noble women to peasants, with the only common factor being his complete disregard for discretion. Royal banquets sometimes doubled as flirtation contests. One ambassador noted that Ferdinand never dined without sampling from multiple courses, political and otherwise. And yet, despite all this, Ferdinand remained popular. His people admired his strength, nobles feared him, and visiting enemies, upon seeing the Black Room, quickly lost interest in rebellion. He ruled for decades, died in his bed, and passed the kingdom to his legitimate heirs. Ferdinand's legacy, a stable kingdom, a terrifying basement, and the firm understanding that some kings build alliances, others collect warning signs in glass cases. The year was 119. The dust of the First Crusade still clung to the broken stones of Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims were flocking to the Holy Land in droves, believing the sacred city was now safe. But outside the city walls, it was chaos. Bandits prowled the roads. Muslim war bands struck caravans, and travelers were butchered or sold into slavery. The dream of Christian safety in the East was collapsing. When a knight named Hug Dion, along with 8 companions, made a vow not to a king, not to a lord, but to God. They pledged to protect Christian pilgrims with their lives. Not just as soldiers, but as monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. No wives, no gold, no lands, just horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A mouthful, yes, but that final phrase mattered because King Baldwin II gave them quarters on the Temple Mount where the ruins of Solomon's temple stood. From this holy ground, they took their name, the Knights Templar. For 9 years, they remained a tiny group, unofficial, underfunded, and dangerously committed. They lived like beggars, borrowing armor, sharing war horses, training like maniacs, but they were disciplined, devout, dangerous, and their reputation began to spread. It wasn't long before their strange blend of monk and warrior caught the attention of one of the most influential men in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was no ordinary abbot. He was a spiritual rock star. When he spoke, popes listened, and he saw something divine in these men. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helped draft the official rule of the Templars, a rigid, monastic code infused with martial purpose. He praised them as the new knighthood, a holy elite who fought not for glory, but for God. With Bernard's blessing and the Pope's approval, the Knights Templar were no longer just a desperate band of misfits. They became a religious order with divine sanction. Donations flowed in. Young nobles abandoned comfortable lives to join their ranks. From the dirt of Jerusalem, the Templars were rising, holy, hungry, and now officially unstoppable. But they had no idea that their greatest blessing, papal independence, would one day mark them for death. With papal recognition secured and their white mantles stitched with blood-red crosses, the Knights Templar weren't just monks with swords anymore. They were the shock troops of Christendom, the Crusader states in the Levant, fragile Christian outposts in a sea of Islamic resistance, were constantly under threat, and the Templars were now the wall that held the tide. Their code was brutal but clear. Never retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. Ransoms, no mercy, no fear. They trained daily, fought with fanatical discipline, and believed death in battle was the highest honor. While most knights fought for plunder and pride, the Templars fought with a terrifying sense of righteousness. They were God's fury on horseback. In the Second Crusade, they proved their worth. While disorganized lords bickered and failed to capture Damascus, the Templars maintained discipline and carved through enemy lines. In skirmishes and open battles, their charges became legendary. It wasn't just their skill, it was their reputation. Muslim commanders began identifying them first in battle reports. Those white-mantled devils with the Red Cross. They didn't just fight, they fortified. Across the Holy Land, the Templars built an iron web of castles and outposts. Sefatosa and the mighty fortress of Bagras. These were no ornamental estates. Templar castles were militarized strongholds with thick walls, trapladon gates, and water systems designed to withstand year-long sieges. When armies fled, Templars stayed behind to buy time or die. But their allegiance was not to kings, not to emperors, only to the Pope. And that made them a rare breed, one that rulers both admired and feared. A king could not command them. A baron could not bribe them. Only the Grand Master, chosen from within, could give the order to fight or stand down. They were sovereign in spirit, even as they bled for the cross. And they weren't just recruiting soldiers. They were building a myth. Their ceremonies were secret, their rites austere, their discipline absolute. To many, they were holy, to others, ominous. And yet their popularity only grew. They had transformed from 9 dusty knights into an elite order spanning continents. But with fame came whispers, and with whispers came envy. The sword of God had become sharp, but someday it would be pointed at them. They began with borrowed armor and a vow of poverty. But within a century, the Knights Templar weren't just warriors. They were the world's most trusted financial institution. They didn't set out to become bankers. War made them rich. Faith made them trusted. And necessity made them brilliant. It started with donations. Nobles eager to support the Holy Land gifted them land, gold, livestock, even entire villages. The Templars didn't just hoard it. They managed it carefully, strategically. They built commanderies across Europe, Agricultural estates run like efficient businesses. Everything was accounted for. Grain, livestock, taxes, tithes. A monk in England could be sending money to support a battle in Jerusalem within weeks. That kind of reach was unheard of. Then came the banking system. A nobleman heading to the Holy Land no longer needed to risk carrying a chest of coins. He could deposit funds with the Templars in Paris, receive a coded letter, and withdraw the same amount in Acre. It was one of the earliest forms of international banking. Templars charged modest fees, kept meticulous records, and never defaulted. They became the Swiss banks of the medieval world, centuries before Switzerland even existed. Their clients, kings, queens, bishops, and merchants. They safeguarded the French crown jewels, managed PayPal finances, funded crusades, ransomed prisoners. In some cases, they even lent money to the very monarchs who would later try to destroy them. The Templars didn't flaunt their wealth. They weren't draped in silk or gold. Their churches were plain, their vestments humble, but beneath that austerity was an empire of ledgers, vaults, and armored wagons, an invisible hand that touched nearly every economy in Europe. And yet they refused to call themselves bankers. They were monks. Everything they did, they claimed, was in service of God. But the more gold they moved, the more enemies they made. The church turned a blind eye. After all, the Templars answered only to the Pope. But kings grew nervous. They owed the Templars fortunes and couldn't control them. What began as a mission to defend pilgrims had evolved into something stranger. They were warriors with no battlefield, monks with no monastery, bankers with no kingdom. And while their coffers grew heavier, so did the weight of suspicion. Power without oversight. That's when kings start sharpening knives. For all their might, the Templars were fighting a losing war. The Crusader states, Outremarre, were castles in the sand, constantly battered by the waves of Islamic resurgence. And leading that tide was Saladin, the brilliant Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Unlike the disorganized and often petty Crusader lords, Saladin was a unifying force, and he had one goal: retake Jerusalem. In 1187, that goal was realized at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars were there, fighting to the last, but they were crushed, outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and surrounded in the searing heat. The Christian army was annihilated. Saladin captured hundreds of knights. Most were ransomed, but when it came to the Templars, no mercy. He executed nearly all of them. To Saladin, they were too dangerous to keep alive. The loss of Jerusalem wasn't just a military blow. It was a spiritual crisis. The city they had sworn to protect was gone. The Holy Sephilah was back in Muslim hands. And with it, the Templars' original purpose had begun to crumble. Still, they regrouped. The Third Crusade brought reinforcements, and Richard the Lionheart, who respected and relied on the Templars in battle. But even he couldn't retake Jerusalem. Over the next century, the Crusader states shrank like dying embers. One by one, cities fell: Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. The last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land was lost. They retreated to Cyprus, where they built new headquarters and tried to maintain relevance. But something had shifted. They were still warriors, but with no Holy Land left to defend. What were they fighting for? Their castles stood empty. Their legends grew dusty. Their discipline, once their hallmark, began to fade. At the same time, rival orders like the Hospitallers gained ground. Accusations of pride, corruption, and arrogance followed the Templars across Europe. Some whispered they had grown too rich, too secretive. Others said they were hoarding relics, dangerous ones. The East had shaped them, forged them, broken them. And now, without it, the Templars were adrift. They still had their wealth, their network, their aura of power. But they had lost the thing that made them essential. A sword with no war, a brotherhood with no crusade. And in that vacuum, powerful enemies were watching. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Knights Templar was still rich, still feared, and still powerful. But for the first time in their history, they were also irrelevant. The Holy Land was lost. No more crusades were on the horizon. They had become a military, order with no war, a religious order with no clear mission, and a financial powerhouse that answered to no king, and that made them a target. No one eyed them with more suspicion or greed than King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. He wasn't called fair for his sense of justice. He was deep in debt, bankrupt from wars with England and Flanders. And the Templars, they were his creditors. He had borrowed massive sums from them to fund his armies and keep his throne. But Philip didn't like being in debt, especially the men he couldn't control. Worse, the Templars were politically independent. They answered only to the Pope, not to the crown. They held land in France, but paid no taxes to the king. They had their own fortresses, their own courts, their own armies. To Philip, they were a dangerous state within his state, untouchable, immovable, and unbearably rich. So, he began planning. Philip's propaganda machine got to work. Rumors spread that the Templars worshipped idols, spat on the cross, performed obscene initiation rites. No evidence, just whispers. But in an age of superstition, whispers were enough. He leaned on his puppet pope, Clement V, pressuring the papacy to investigate. Clement hesitated, but Philip wasn't waiting. In secret, Philip orchestrated one of the most coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. He set a date, gathered his soldiers, prepared his torturers, and on one cold Friday morning, in October 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. All across France, Templar knights were seized, interrogated, imprisoned, tortured. Confessions were forced. Some broke within hours, others resisted until their bodies did. It was treason wrapped in holy justice, and it worked. The public, once loyal, began to turn. The Pope, pressured and humiliated, found himself cornered. The tide had turned, not in battle, but in politics, and the warrior monks, who once rode into enemy lines, now sat chained in dungeons, accused of sins that no sword could defend. October 13th, 1307, the day that forever cursed, Friday the 13th, in the Western imagination. At dawn, across every corner of France, armed men moved in silence. Their orders were clear. Arrest every Templar you can find. No warning, no resistance allowed. The king's justice had arrived, with swords drawn and warrants sealed in secrecy. Thousands of knights were dragged from their beds, some in full armor, others in prayer. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay was taken in Paris, betrayed by the very kingdom whose crown jewels he had once safeguarded. Across cities and countryside, Templar commanderies were raided, their vaults cracked open, and their libraries seized. The charges were fantastical: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, sodomy, devil rituals. Most of it was invented whole cloth by Philip's lawyers. But in an era of fear and religious zealotry, it didn't need to be true. It just needed to be believable. And the Templars, they were silenced with fire and iron. Torture chambers lit up across France. Men were stretched, burned, crushed, flayed, until their confessions dripped from them like blood. They admitted to whatever their inquisitors wanted, that they denied Christ, that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet, that they kissed one another in secret ceremonies. Under unbearable agony, even Grandmaster de Molay confessed, then later recanted. It was theater masquerading as justice, a king destroying his creditors by accusing them of sins so grotesque no one dared defend them. The Pope Clement V was humiliated. He had tried to mediate, but Philip had moved too fast, too ruthlessly. Backed into a corner, Clement ordered his own investigation. Other countries like England and Spain hesitated. In many cases, the accusations were dismissed or the Templars released. But in France, the machinery of condemnation rolled on. Philip confiscated their wealth, though much of it mysteriously disappeared. Some whispered the Templars had moved their treasure. Others claimed it had never been found. Still others said the real treasure wasn't gold, but knowledge, secrets, relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. The Templars were no longer a brotherhood. They were fugitives, prisoners, dead men walking. The king had dealt his blow, not with armies, but with ink, fire, and lies. And the world would never look at the Red Cross the same way again. By 1312, the end was inevitable. The Knights Templar, once the most powerful military order in Christendom, had been reduced to broken men in dark cells. Their confessions, wrenched out under torture, were used as justification for what came next. And what came next was dissolution. Under intense pressure from King Philip IV, Pope Clement V formally disbanded the Templar order at the Council of Vienne in March 1312. The papal bull in excelso stripped them of their titles, their holdings, and their very identity. Officially, the Templars were no more. The Holy See declared it an act of mercy, not a conviction, but a necessary step to prevent further scandal. In reality, it was a political execution dressed in ecclesiastical robes. The order's properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but not everything made it there. Much of the Templars' wealth, treasures, ledgers, and rumored relics simply vanished. Some claimed it was hidden. Others believed it was quietly absorbed by Philip's treasury. Whatever the case, the Templars' vast financial empire dissolved like smoke, leaving behind only questions. But the final act had not yet played. In 1314, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay, who had spent 7 long years in prison, was led out to a scaffold in Paris. He was to be executed alongside Geoffroy de Cara, another senior Templar. Both had recanted their confessions, insisting until the end that the order was innocent, and for that defiance they would burn. They were tied to a wooden stake on a small island in the Seine. As the flames rose, Demolay shouted through the smoke, calling on God to judge those who had condemned him. According to legend, he cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement, declaring they would die within the year, and they did. Clement succumbed to illness within a month. Philip followed later that year. Suddenly, and without warning, some whispered it was divine justice. Others called it coincidence. But the myth stuck. The Templars had died cursing their killers, and the heavens had listened. With that, the last true voice of the Knights Templar was silenced in fire. Their story ended not in battle, but in betrayal, torture, and flame. Yet, even as they were erased from the map, their legend was just beginning to take root. The fires of the Templar executions died out, but the embers of their legend burned hotter than ever. With the order disbanded, their castles seized, and their leaders executed, it seemed their story was over. But something strange happened. Instead of fading from memory, the Knights Templar transformed from disgraced monks into eternal symbols of mystery and power. The secrecy that had once protected them now fed rumors. What happened to their treasure? Where were their scrolls, their relics, their holy knowledge? Some believed the Templars had spirited away the Holy Grail before their arrest. Others whispered they had hidden the Ark of the Covenant or guarded descendants of Jesus himself. There was no proof, just shadows. But in the medieval world, shadows were enough. Then came the idea that the Templars had survived underground. Though officially disbanded, many former Templars quietly blended into society. Some joined other monastic orders. Some became mercenaries. But others, legend claimed, went secret. They formed hidden brotherhoods, preserving their rituals and relics in silence, biding their time. Centuries later, those stories mutated into myths. The Templars were credited or blamed for everything from the construction of Gothic cathedrals to the founding of Freemasonry. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds. That the Templars controlled banks, thrones, revolutions, that they had never truly been defeated, just disguised. That behind every major event in history, some hidden hand in a white mantle guided the outcome. Pop culture didn't help. The Templars showed up in books, games, films, sometimes as heroes, other times as villains. Don Brown's The Da Vinci Code turned them into custodians of holy bloodlines. Assassin's Creed made them a global cabal, pulling the strings of civilization. Each retelling distorted the truth, but fed the fascination. In reality, the Templars were flesh and blood, brave, yes, flawed. Certainly religious warriors who tried to mix monastic vows with the violence of war and paid the price. But myths endure because they offer something history often can't. Answers, meaning, mystery. The real Templars died on scaffolds and in dungeons. But the mythological Templars, they still ride in the imagination, eternal, armored, and cloaked in secrecy. And in that sense, Philip the Fair failed. He destroyed their bodies, but their legend untouchable. More than 7 centuries have passed since the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned alive on the banks of the Seine. But the Red Cross still lingers in literature, in architecture, in symbols carved into old stone, and whispered through conspiracy theories. The Templars may be gone, but their legacy is anything but dead. They were more than just warriors. They were innovators. In an age when kings still ruled by divine right and banking was seen as a sin, the Templars created a pan-European network of finance, logistics, and diplomacy. Their letters of credit prefigured modern checks. Their commanderies functioned like regional branches of a multinational corporation. They were an early blueprint for globalization, built not with stock markets, but with swords and sacred vows. Militarily, they redefined what it meant to be a knight. Before the Templars, chivalry was a personal code, flexible and often ignored. The Templars turned it into an institution, a discipline enforced with brutal consistency. They weren't lone champions jousting for glory. They were units trained like modern special forces, willing to die for an abstract ideal. And die. They did, often in silence, sometimes in vain, but never without impact. Culturally, they changed how the West viewed religion and warfare. The concept of the warrior monk challenged the notion that holiness and violence were incompatible. They showed that belief could be weaponized, not just in battle, but in politics, finance, and propaganda. And when they fell, it was that same belief in their supposed heresy that justified their destruction. Their fall also served as a cautionary tale. The Templars became a symbol of unchecked power, answerable to no one, protected by the Pope, richer than kings. Their downfall exposed the fragility of institutions, even those wrapped in divine authority. It was a medieval version of a corporate takedown, executed not by shareholders but by royalty in Rome. Today, their image is more myth than man, but myths shaped memory, and the memory of the Templars, courageous, flawed, betrayed, reminds us that history isn't just written in victories. Sometimes it's etched in ash. So the next time you see a red cross on white cloth, remember it was once worn by men who believed they were doing God's work until politics, ambition, and fear decided otherwise. And in that clash of steel, gold, and fire, their legend was born. In 12th century Paris, the world was changing. Trade routes were expanding, universities were rising, and the church was flexing its muscles like never before. It was an age of ambition, political, spiritual, architectural, and in the center of this rising city stood a dream made of stone. That dream belonged to Maurice Doully, the Bishop of Paris. Appointed in 1160, he wasn't just a man of God. He was a visionary. The existing cathedral Saint-Anne was crumbling and unimpressive. Paris was growing, and its religious heart needed to match the city's stature. So Sully dreamed bigger, much bigger. He proposed a cathedral so immense, so awe-inspiring, it would dwarf everything around it. A monument, not just to the Virgin Mary, but to the power and glory of the Catholic Church in France. This wouldn't be a Romanesque fortress like the ones before it. It would be something new, something radical, something Gothic. In 1163, that dream began to take form. According to tradition, Pope Alexander III himself laid the first stone during a ceremonial blessing. Construction began on the eastern end, the choir and apse, where priests would one day sing hymns beneath towering arches of glass and stone. But this was no ordinary build. Notre Dame wasn't just a building, it was a generational commitment. And so the people of Paris, stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, and artists, began the work. They hauled limestone from nearby quarries, shaped it with medieval tools, and raised scaffolding that scraped the heavens. Every block was laid by hand. Every carving, every window, every rib of the vault, crafted with patience, faith, and sweat. It would take decades to complete even the first sections. Workers labored, knowing they would never live to see the towers finished. Sons inherited chisels from fathers. Generations passed, with Notre Dame still rising slowly, gloriously above the Parisian skyline. But for Bishop Dooley, the goal was clear: to build a house of God so magnificent that merely entering it would humble the soul. NRAAM was never meant to be just a church. It was an act of worship carved in stone, a testament to what humanity could build when it aimed for heaven. The first stone was only the beginning. What came next would reshape the skyline and the soul of medieval Europe. As the 1170s unfolded, Notre Dame began to rise, not as a structure, but as a symbol. In a city of narrow timber houses and muddy streets, the cathedral slowly took form, towering over the skyline like a stone sermon. The Gothic style, still in its infancy, was about to redefine what churches could be. Not just shelters of prayer, but instruments of awe. The work moved from east to west, beginning with the choir, where priests would one day perform sacred rites, and then to the nave, the vast open space for the common faithful. The architecture was revolutionary. The walls were thinner, the ceilings higher. The pointed arches allowed more weight to be shifted downward, and those ribbed vaults, they didn't just support the ceiling, they sang upward, drawing the eye and the soul toward heaven. But perhaps the most radical idea was light. Unlike the dim Romanesque churches of old, NRAM was built to glow. Massive stained glass windows began to appear, filtering colored light into sacred geometry. Scenes from Scripture burst into life with the rising sun. The church wasn't just telling stories anymore. It was illuminating them. Every piece of Notre Dame had meaning. The columns weren't just supports. They represented saints. The archways weren't just decoration. They were passageways to salvation. The stone was theology, and the masons were its scribes. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Paris was transforming. The cathedral became a heartbeat. Markets clustered around it. Sermons echoed across the Seine. Students from the burgeoning University of Paris gathered in its shadow. Notre Dame wasn't just a building. It was becoming the soul of the city. Yet progress was slow. There were no cranes, no power tools, just muscle, wood scaffolding, and endless resolve. Hundreds of workers toiled year after year. When one died, another took his place. Names were rarely recorded. Their reward wasn't fame, but faith. They built not for themselves, but for God and generations unborn. By 1200, the choir and much of the nave stood tall. The outlines of a miracle were taking shape. Notre Dame was no longer a dream. It was stone and glass, sweat and prayer. And just as the structure reached skyward, so too did the ambitions of its builders. Because what they planned next would defy gravity and reason. Notre Dame was unlike anything the city had ever seen, but it was also dangerously ambitious. As the walls rose and the vated ceilings expanded, a problem emerged. The weight. The stone ceilings pressed outward, not just downward. The higher the vaults climbed, the more they threatened to push the walls apart. Traditional Romanesque churches solved this with thick walls and tiny windows. But Notre Dame was built to breathe, to glow, to reach the heavens in both spirit and space. That's when the Masons did something revolutionary. They took a bold architectural idea, one barely tested at the time, and ran with it. The flying buttress. These weren't mere supports. They were external arms of stone, arching from the upper walls down to solid piers standing apart from the main building. Like skeletal wings, they braced the cathedral from the outside, transferring the outward force of the ceiling into the ground where it could do no harm. From the ground they looked impossibly delicate, like lace made of limestone. But they were engineering genius, and they allowed NRAAM to become what it was always meant to be, a structure of air, light, and impossible height. The use of flying buttresses changed everything. With the pressure off the interior walls, the builders could add even more windows. The great rose windows, vast wheels of stained glass depicting saints, angels, and apocalypse were no longer a dream. They became reality. Color exploded into the sacred space. And God's stories now came not just from the pulpit, but from sunlight itself. Ironically, The original plans for Notre Dame didn't include flying buttresses. Early Gothic builders hadn't yet grasped their full potential. But as the structure grew, so did the strain. The masons adapted on the fly, literally. They began adding these stone wings in the early 1200s, turning necessity into poetry. Critics at the time were divided. Some thought the exposed supports were unsightly, interrupting the clean silhouette of the building, but most stood in awe. Notre looked like it was being held in place by stone angels mid-flight. The cathedral was no longer just a house of God. It was a living demonstration of what faith and math could build together. A hymn carved in gravity-deafing limestone, and its wings had only just begun to spread. By the early 1200s, Notre Dame had already transformed the Parisian skyline, but its most iconic features were still taking shape. As the eastern end neared completion, attention shifted westward. What rose there would become the face of the cathedral. The part most people would recognize first. The twin towers and the monumental west facade. This facade wasn't just an entrance. It was a statement, spiritual, architectural, and political. The church wanted you to feel small as you approached it, and it succeeded. The doors soared to impossible heights. Above them, rows of sculpted kings, prophets, saints, and demons watched every visitor. You weren't just entering a building. You were walking into sacred judgment. Construction began on the west towers around the 12 and 20s. Like everything else at Notre Dame, they took decades to finish. Each tower rose in stages, block by block, higher and higher, until they reached nearly 70 meters tall. And yet they were never completed as originally planned. No spires, no needle points, just massive flat-topped silhouettes, majestic in their simplicity. Between the towers sat the Gallery of Kings, 28 statues representing the monarchs of Judah, misunderstood during the French Revolution as French kings and tragically decapitated by angry mobs. But during the 13th century, they sent a clear message: divine right, heavenly order, sacred rule. The church and the crown walked hand in hand, and this was their front porch. Below them, the three great portals served as theological storytelling in stone. The central one, the portal of the Last Judgment, was carved with Christ seated in glory, flanked by angels, demons, and resurrected souls rising from their graves. To the illiterate masses, these scenes weren't decoration. They were doctrine. The message was clear. Enter with reverence. Eternity starts here. Above the doors, a rose window bloomed into being, nearly 10 meters across, framed by intricate tracery and flanked by statues of the Virgin Mary and Child. Light passed through colored glass like a divine spotlight, projecting saints across the nave. By the mid-1200s, the towers were nearly done. The facade stood complete, solemn, symmetrical, overwhelming. It was a fortress of faith, a billboard for God's authority, and a warning to the sinner. And yet, the builders weren't done. The heart of Notre Dame still needed finishing. The transept, the roof, the spire that would one day pierce the clouds. They had built its face. Now they would give it a crown. With the towers and west facades standing in proud defiance of gravity, Notre Dame was becoming more than a shell. It needed a soul. And that soul lived inside within the vast expanse of its nave, its transepts, and its sacred choir. These were the spaces that would carry the voices of monks, the footsteps of kings, and the prayers of thousands. By the mid-1200s, work focused on the transepts, the arms of the cross-shaped layout that gave Gothic cathedrals their iconic floor plan. Under architect G.L. and later Pierre de Montreuil, these wings were expanded and adorned with new rose windows, even more ornate than those on the western end. The north transept featured a luminous window that bathed the space in cool blues and heavenly purples. The south warmer, fiery, and just as divine. These weren't just design choices. They were theology in color. The northern window represented the Old Testament, the southern the New. The two wings told the full story of salvation. One illuminated in light, the other in fire. Inside the cathedral, columns soared like tree trunks in a forest of stone. Vaulted ceilings stretched nearly 35 meters high, their ribbed arches meeting like palms in prayer. This wasn't architecture, it was choreography, an upward motion guiding the soul toward heaven. And then there was the altar, the sacred center of the space. Here the Mass was celebrated, here relics were venerated, and here the elite of France came to kneel. Royal weddings, coronation masses, papal visits, Notre Dame became the spiritual stage for the nation itself. But it wasn't just the elite who filled these walls. The people came too. Merchants, peasants, pilgrims. The cathedral became a public sanctuary, echoing with sermons, songs, and the occasional scolding from the pulpit. It was a place to witness miracles or to beg for one. Every surface inside told a story. The sculptures, the stained glass, even the floor tiles. NRA-AM didn't just house the divine, it performed it. Faith was everywhere. Carved in stone, floating in incense, radiating from glass. By the late 13th century, the interior was nearly complete. The heart of the cathedral beat strong, but it still lacked one thing, a crown to pierce the heavens. And that's when they began building the spire. By the end of the 1200s, Notre Dame already looked like a miracle. Its towers soared, its nave echoed with sacred chants, and its rose windows flooded the interior with divine light. But something still seemed unfinished. The cathedral had a face, a heart, and wings, but no crown. No vertical accent to lead the eye beyond the roofline and into the heavens. That's when plans began for the spire. Unlike the twin towers, which were heavy and grounded, the spire would be elegant, an upward-pointing needle rising from the crossing of the transept, right at the center of the church's cruciform layout. Constructed from oak and clad in lead, the original spire was both a technical challenge and a spiritual statement. This wasn't just decoration, it was the exclamation point of Notre Dame, its most visible prayer. Its construction demanded master carpenters and metalsmiths. Oak beams were hoisted by human power, winches, pulleys, scaffolding. The structure had to be light, yet stable to withstand the winds that battered Paris from the Seine. When finished, the spire pierced the sky like a sword lifted in devotion. And beneath it, even more intricate work was unfolding. Gargoyles, those bizarre, haunting creatures, emerged from the stone. They weren't just grotesque for fun. Many served as waterspouts, diverting rain away from the masonry. Others were symbolic, guardians meant to frighten away evil or remind sinners of what awaited them. The final phase also included dozens of chimeas, statues of hybrid beasts perched high above Paris, their eyes forever scanning the horizon. They were nightmare and marvel rolled into one, part of the Gothic love affair with mystery and symbolism. Inside the chapels were completed, choir stalls carved in relics enshrined. NRAAM was now fully operational, both a sacred machine and a national stage. It had taken over a century of work, tens of thousands of workers, and the faith of an entire kingdom. By 1345, nearly 200 years after the first stone was laid, the cathedral was considered complete. But complete was never the right word. Notre Dame was never frozen in time. It would be restored, reinvented, and resurrected across centuries. But by the 14th century, the structure itself was done. The Gothic age had built its masterpiece. By the mid-14th century, Notre Dame de Paris was no longer just a cathedral. It was the cathedral, a towering symbol of Catholic dominance, royal authority, and national identity. For the next 4 centuries, it stood not only as the heart of Paris, but as a stage upon which the great dramas of France would unfold. It became the beating heart of state religion, hosting coronations, royal weddings, and solemn funerals. When kings married, they did so under its vaulted ceilings. When wars were declared or victories celebrated, the bells of Notre Dame rang loud across the Seine. Monarchs entered as rulers of land and exited as chosen of God. But it wasn't only kings who passed through those great doors. Generals, bishops, and foreign dignitaries came to kneel or negotiate. And when disasters struck, famines, plagues, invasions, Parisians filled the nave with prayers and processions, desperate for divine intervention. The cathedral became a sanctuary of hope and fear. always watching, always waiting. Politically, NRAAM became the spiritual anchor of the French monarchy. Its central location on the Ile-de-Seat, at the literal and symbolic heart of Paris, made it the perfect backdrop for ritualized power. Priests, blessed banners before war. The crown was linked not just to royal blood, but to divine mandates. If the king ruled France, then NRAAM ruled his soul, and culturally, it remained a center of awe. Pilgrims traveled miles just to glimpse its sacred relics, including the crown of thorns, believed to have been worn by Christ himself. Its great organ thundered during feast days. Its choirs echoed with polyphonic music that pushed medieval boundaries. Notre Dame wasn't static. It evolved, absorbing new art styles, musical traditions, and liturgical forms. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, its Gothic beauty began to fall out of favor. Baroque architecture was in vogue, and NRAAM, dark, spiky, and medieval, was seen as outdated. Some renovations were even attempted to modernize its look, smoothing what had once been daring. Still, it stood, a cathedral caught between centuries, revered yet increasingly overlooked. Its towers weathered storms and time. Its bells still tolled. But something was shifting beneath its foundations. NRAM had been born from faith and crowned by kings. But soon it would face a force even stone couldn't ignore: revolution. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Notre Dame de Paris found itself on the wrong side of history. For centuries, it had stood as a monument to monarchy and religion, two of the very institutions the revolution sought to erase. Suddenly, the cathedral that had once crowned kings became a symbol of oppression, and symbols during revolutions rarely survive untouched. The attack was ideological and physical. Revolutionaries stormed into the cathedral. Statues of the biblical kings that adorned the facade were mistaken for French monarchs. All 28 were beheaded. Sculptures were smashed. Altars desecrated. The great bells that had once tolled for royal births and papal visits were torn down and melted for cannon metal. Precious relics like the crown of thorns were removed and hidden. Many were lost. What remained was a hollowed shell. Notre Dame was officially deconsecrated in 1793. It was no longer a church. Instead, it became the so-called Temple of Reason, repurposed for revolutionary festivals, celebrating secular enlightenment. At one point, it was even used as a warehouse for storing wine. The soaring nave, once echoing with hymns, now smelled of spilled barrels and damp stone. The spire, damaged and decaying, was eventually dismantled for safety. Gargoyles fell from their perches. The roof leaked. Rats scurried through the crypt. It seemed as though Paris no longer had a heart, just a forgotten ruin in its center. And yet, it survived. When Napoleon came to power, he recognized the symbolic power of NRAM. In 1804, he chose it as the site of his self-coronation as emperor. The cathedral was reconsecrated and cleaned up just enough to host a lavish ceremony. But this wasn't a religious act, it was theater. Napoleon crowned himself, famously snatching the crown from the Pope's hands. Notre Dame once again served the powerful, but without the sanctity it had once embodied. Still, decades of neglect left their scars. By the 1830s, Notre Dame was crumbling physically and spiritually. It was slated for demolition more than once. Some Parisians thought it would be better to replace it with something modern, something less medieval, less haunting. And then, a writer stepped in, a writer who would see past the cracked stones and shattered statues to something eternal, something worth saving. Because just when the world was ready to forget NRAM, Victor Hugo reminded them. In 1831, a book hit the shelves that would save a cathedral. Victor Hugo's NRAAM Debauched, later known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, wasn't just a Gothic novel. It was a passionate plea for preservation. Through the eyes of Quasimodo, the deformed bell ringer, Hugo turned NRAAM into more than just a backdrop. It was a living character, wounded, misunderstood, beautiful in its decay, and the public listened. The novel stirred hearts across France. Suddenly, Parisians realized what they were about to lose. Notre wasn't just old. It was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. The outcry worked. By 1844, King Louis Philippe approved a full-scale restoration of the cathedral. Leading the charge were two architects, Hugues Violet, Luc and Jean Baptiste Lassus. Their goal wasn't just to repair the damage, but to restore the soul of the cathedral. They replaced eroded statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and reimagined the spire that had been removed during the Revolution. This new spire, designed by Viola Luc, would rise 96 meters above the ground, taller and more ornate than the original. It would become one of the most iconic silhouettes in Europe throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Notre Dame returned to its rightful place at the spiritual and cultural center of Paris. It hosted masses, witnessed liberation ceremonies, and welcomed millions of visitors. It survived 2 world wars. During the Nazi occupation, its bells remained silent. When Paris was finally liberated in 1944, they rang out in triumph. But tragedy would strike again. On April 15, 2019, a fire broke out beneath the roof. Within minutes, flames engulfed the wooden lattice known as the forest. Some beams dating back to the 13th century. The fire raged for hours. The roof collapsed. The 19th century spire fell in a plume of smoke. The world watched in horror as one of humanity's greatest monuments seemed to vanish in real time. And yet, once again, it survived. The stone tower stood firm. The rose windows endured. The relics were saved. And the people of France, along with the world, vowed to rebuild. NRAAM has always been more than architecture. It is memory, identity, resilience, a church, a symbol, a survivor. And in every stone that rises from its ashes, it reminds us faith and beauty can be reborn. She was born in 1775 in the Guangdong province of China. Her birth name was never recorded. History would come to know her simply as Zheng Yi Sao, wife of Zheng Yi. But what she did with that name would shake empires. In her early years, she was a prostitute aboard a Cantonese floating brothel, a common reality for poor girls in 18th century coastal China. These so-called flower boats catered to merchants, naval officers, and pirates. But she wasn't like the others. She listened, she watched, she remembered names. She made powerful clients talk. Over time, she became more than entertainment. She became an information broker. And then came Zheng Yi, a powerful pirate lord who commanded the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most formidable pirate factions in the South China Sea. He wasn't the first pirate she served, but he would be the last. Struck by her wit and cunning, Zheng Yi proposed marriage. She accepted, but not without terms. In a move practically unheard of in her time, she negotiated her position. She wanted joint control of the fleet, not just as a wife, but as a partner. She would handle political alliances, manage plunder, and have a say in every strategic move. Zheng Yi agreed. Whether out of love or shrewdness, he knew she was an asset. Their marriage in 1801 was the beginning of one of the most successful pirate dynasties in history. Geneso quickly embedded herself into the fabric of pirate politics. She studied the hierarchies, the rivalries, and the codes of the pirate world. While Zheng Yi sailed and conquered, she quietly built networks, recruited allies, and learned to rule from the shadows. But she didn't stay in the shadows for long. When Zheng Yi suddenly died in 1807, possibly in a typhoon, many assumed his empire would fracture. Dozens of pirate captains waited to pounce, expecting a power vacuum. What they got instead was a power grab. Zheng Yao stepped into command, not with brute force, but with strategy. She took over the Red Flag Fleet. She solidified alliances, and she married Junji's adopted son and lieutenant, Chung Po-sai, ensuring both personal loyalty and military strength from prostitute to pirate queen in less than a decade. And she was just getting started. When Zheng Yao took command in 1807, she didn't just inherit a pirate fleet. She inherited a floating kingdom. But instead of it splintering in chaos after her husband's death, she tightened her grip and made it even more powerful. Under her rule, the Red Flag Fleet didn't just survive, it multiplied. The South China Sea had long been plagued by pirates. But what Zheng Yi Sao commanded was unprecedented. She oversaw an armada of over 300 ships, and within a year, that number swelled to more than 600. Some estimates claim she eventually led over 1,800 vessels with up to 70,000 men under her command, more than the navies of several European powers combined at the time. She did this with ruthless pragmatism and a keen understanding of pirate psychology. She maintained power not just through force, but by creating a system that bound her captains to her. She instituted a strict code of laws that governed every part of pirate life: loot, loyalty, discipline, and punishment. Disobedience was met with swift brutality. Anyone caught stealing from the common treasury lost their head. If a pirate assaulted a female captive without permission, he was executed. If a pirate deserted, his ears were cut off and he was paraded before the fleet as a warning. But it wasn't just fear. Zheng Yi Sao offered protection, structure, and profit. Her code allowed pirates to keep a fair share of loot, 20%, while the rest went to a communal fund managed by her. This gave everyone a stake in the system and built loyalty through stability. Even defeated rivals and coastal villagers often chose to join her rather than resist. She divided the massive fleet into 6 squadrons, each with its own color: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green, but all ultimately reported to her. Her closest ally and second-in-command, Chung Po Sai, led the Red Squadron, her elite force. Under Zheng Yao, piracy became a government of its own, with taxation, defense, and hierarchy. She ruled sea lanes from Vietnam to Hong Kong, controlling trade, raiding imperial outposts, and even collecting tributes from coastal towns. The Qing dynasty had a navy, Zheng Yao had an empire, and it was only growing. Zheng Yao didn't just rule with charisma, she ruled with rules, iron ones. While the image of pirates often conjures up chaos and drunken raillery, her fleet operated more like a disciplined corporation than a gang of outlaws. And at the center of this structure was her pirate code, a detailed system of laws that turned mayhem into method. This code wasn't some romantic parchment passed around by candlelight. It was brutal, binding, and enforced without hesitation. Every captain and crew member knew the stakes. Violation meant humiliation at best, execution at worst. One of the most infamous rules governed the division of spoils. After a raid, all loot had to be presented to the fleet's central storehouse. The pirate responsible received a 20% cut, while the rest went into the collective pool. That pool, controlled by Zheng Yi Sao and her officers, was used for fleet maintenance, widow pensions, bribes, and emergency funds. Stealing from the collective wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable by death. Then came discipline. Disobedience in battle was a serious offense. Cowards who abandoned their squadron or disobeyed orders could be flogged, executed, or thrown into the sea. Desertion, immediate decapitation. The code even addressed relationships. If a pirate kidnapped a woman, he was required to treat her with respect. Sexual assault was grounds for execution by beheading. She wasn't interested in chaos. She was interested in control, and the code gave her that. It created a reliable system where pirates knew the rules, the consequences, and their share. It bound loyalty not just to Zheng Yi Sao as a leader, but to the system she embodied. Incredibly, she allowed prisoners and coastal civilians to join her forces. In exchange, they had to swear loyalty to her code. Many did. Some joined out of fear, others out of admiration. Some simply understood that, under Zheng Yi Sao, piracy was safer, more profitable, and strangely more fair than life under the corrupting authorities. Her laws extended beyond the decks of ships. Coastal villages under her protection paid tribute in exchange for safety and autonomy. Those who resisted were burned to the ground. Those who complied became part of her growing empire. She wasn't just a pirate, she was a sovereign. and her code was law. By 1808, Zhang Yisou's pirate empire was no longer just a maritime nuisance. It was a national threat. Her fleet dominated the South China Sea, disrupted trade routes, and raided coastal towns with impunity. The Qing dynasty, embarrassed and overwhelmed, was forced to act, but they weren't ready for what they were up against. The Imperial Navy launched a campaign to crush the pirates, sending multiple warships to hunt down Zheng Yao's fleet. What followed was not a series of quick victories, but a humiliating display of imperial incompetence. Time and again, the Navy was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outclassed by Zheng Yao's forces. She knew the waters better than anyone. She used weather patterns, island cover, and shallow tides to trap heavier Qing ships. Her sailors could fight in coordinated units, switch vessels mid-battle, and lure enemies into ambushes with terrifying precision. On more than one occasion, entire Qing squadrons were captured, their ships absorbed into the Red Flag fleet, and morale. The difference was staggering. While imperial officers were often corrupt, underpaid, or cowardly, Zheng Yisou's men were well organized and fiercely loyal, bound by her code and rewarded for victory. As the battles dragged on, the Qing dynasty's desperation became obvious. They appealed to European powers, namely the Portuguese and the British, to assist in naval engagements. These foreign navies had more advanced ships and firepower, but they lacked the local knowledge and unity of purpose that Zheng Yisou's armada possessed. Still, the pressure mounted. By 1809, a coalition of Qing, Portuguese, and Cantonese forces surrounded parts of her fleet. Yet even then, she fought them off, retreating strategically and launching counterattacks that stunned her enemies. She wasn't just surviving, she was humiliating the empire. But the war was costly. Sustained conflict drained resources and exhausted men. Even pirate empires can't endure war forever. And while she remained unbeaten at sea, Zheng Yao understood something crucial. Sometimes power isn't about winning every fight. Sometimes it's about knowing when to walk away with everything intact. She had no intention of dying at sea or being dragged in chains to aching court. She had a different plan, one that would leave even her enemies stunned. By 1810, Zheng Yisou had done the impossible. She had held off the might of the Qing dynasty, humiliated foreign navies, and ruled the waves with unmatched dominance. But she was also a realist. She knew that wars, especially ones with endless fronts and growing enemies, couldn't be fought forever. Supplies were thinning, alliances strained, and her fleet, though still massive, was beginning to feel the weight of attrition. So, she changed tactics. Zheng Yao reached out to the Qing government, not with surrender, but with terms, bold ones. She knew she held leverage. The Qing had failed to beat her militarily. Their own citizens feared her more than they respected the empire. She could bargain not as a criminal begging for mercy, but as a leader of a state. She traveled to Guangzhou personally on her own ship, surrounded by armed guards, flying the Red Flag fleet colors proudly. It wasn't a plea, it was a power move. She requested amnesty, not just for herself, but for her entire fleet. Thousands of pirates. She demanded the right to keep her wealth. She even insisted her second-in-command and husband, Cheng Poi, be given a military rank in the Qing Navy. The government was stunned, but the truth was, they were tired, too. The empire couldn't afford another costly, drawn-out campaign. So, in a moment of rare pragmatism, they agreed. Zheng Yisou surrendered with style. On April 18, 1810, she led over 17,000 pirates, men, women, and children, into the city, not in chains, but in procession. Over 200 ships were handed over, weapons laid down ceremonially, and the entire pirate confederation disbanded without a drop of blood spilled. No trials, no executions, no forfeit of wealth. Cheng Poi was granted a captaincy in the Qing Navy. Zheng Yisou retired as a free woman, untouched, undefeated, and still immensely rich. In a world where most pirate stories end in betrayal or death, Zheng Yisou ended with negotiation and retirement. She had played the game perfectly, first with cannons, then with words. And as her red banners came down, her legend was only beginning to rise. Most pirate stories end in blood, gallows, or obscurity. But Zheng Yao didn't just escape that fate. She built a second life from it. After negotiating the greatest pirate surrender in history, she walked away, not as a fugitive, but as a respected wealthy woman, with her legacy intact. In 1810, after the surrender of her fleet, she settled in Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, with her husband, Chong Poye, who now served as a captain in Nanjing Navy. The transition from pirate queen to respectable citizen might seem absurd, but for Zheng Yao, it was just another act of calculated survival. She lived openly, even comfortably, and the Qing authorities largely left her alone. Rather than fading into obscurity, she quietly became a businesswoman. She opened a gambling house and an opium smuggling operation, technically illegal, but largely overlooked due to her influence. She wasn't out to build another empire, but she had no intention of being forgotten either. She kept her connections, protected her wealth, and lived on her terms. Her marriage to Chung Po Sai endured, and together they raised a family, while he continued serving the Qing Navy, hunting down pirates ironically similar to their past selves. Zheng Yao focused on their business interests. She moved in elite circles, consulted on maritime affairs, and remained a legendary figure among sailors and traders throughout the South China coast. What's extraordinary isn't just that she lived, it's how she lived. She broke every mold her society had for women. Born poor, sold into prostitution, she clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated criminal world. Then, instead of dying in battle or on the scaffold, she retired peacefully and died of old age in 1844 at the age of 69. She didn't seek redemption. She didn't need it. Her life was the ultimate act of defiance, a living rebuttal to every law, custom, and expectation set before her. In a time when women were barely allowed to speak in public, Zheng Yao commanded fleets, dictated treaties, and negotiated with emperors. And then she walked away richer and freer than any pirate in history. Her sails lowered, her cannons quiet, yet her legend still echoed across the sea. History remembers pirates like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan, men who roamed the Caribbean, sowed chaos, and met violent ends. But in the shadow of their infamy stands Zheng Yao, not only as their equal, but as someone who surpassed them by almost every measure. She didn't captain a handful of ships. She commanded entire fleets. She didn't plunder a few coastal towns. She controlled entire regions of the sea. And she didn't die on the gallows or in a gunfight. She negotiated her way out of piracy and into peace. Among the pantheon of pirate legends, she remains the most successful and least understood. But make no mistake, her success wasn't just luck or ruthlessness. It was strategy, intellect, and a deep understanding of power. She was a tactician, a politician, and a psychologist. She knew how to keep loyalty through fear, yes, but also through order, reward, and a carefully crafted system. And what made her truly exceptional was the fact that she achieved all of this as a woman in Qing-era China, a society steeped in confusion ideals that confined women to silence and servitude. Women weren't expected to lead in the marketplace, much less on the high seas. Zheng Yao didn't just challenge that norm, she shattered it. She earned the respect of hardened pirate captains, forced the Qing dynasty to the negotiating table, and ended her life as a business owner and matriarch. She wasn't dependent on a man's legacy. She took it, expanded it, and made it her own. In popular memory, she remains something of a phantom, less famous than her male counterparts, less romanticized in Western literature, and often omitted from mainstream history. But within maritime circles and Chinese coastal lore, she is spoken of with awe. The red flag fleet may have vanished, its sails lowered for good, but the memory of Zheng Yao lingers like a ghost ship, silent, untouchable, and larger than life. Not just a pirate, not just a woman, but a legend that made empires kneel. And in a world ruled by men, she didn't ask for a place at the table. She took the entire ocean. Despite commanding the largest pirate fleet the world has ever seen, Zheng Yao remains strangely absent from most mainstream history books. Her legacy, though immense, has been obscured, overshadowed by Western pirate myths, and buried beneath layers of colonial bias, gender prejudice, and political discomfort. Why? Because her story doesn't fit the traditional mold. She wasn't a tragic anti-hero like Blackbeard. She didn't die in battle. She wasn't European. And most threatening of all, she was a woman who outplayed an empire. That kind of power disrupts the neat male-dominated narrative historians have long preferred. In Chinese official records, she's treated more like a problem solved than a figure worth studying. The Qing dynasty didn't want to celebrate her. They wanted to forget her. After all, she exposed their naval weakness, defied imperial authority, and walked away without punishment. Even in success, she was an embarrassment to the throne. Western historians fared no better. For centuries, piracy has been romanticized through a European lens. Peg legs, rum, parrots, and plunder. Zheng Yao didn't fit that image. She wasn't swashbuckling. She was strategic. She didn't duel for glory. She negotiated for power. She wasn't killed by the state. She negotiated with it and won. And for many chroniclers, that wasn't exciting. It was inconvenient. But in recent decades, her legend has re-emerged. Scholars, feminist historians, and pirate enthusiasts have begun to resurrect her memory, reclaiming her place in the global story of maritime power. Documentaries, historical novels, and even video games have started to acknowledge the pirate queen of the South China Sea. And still so much of her life remains shrouded in mystery. Her real name is lost. Much of her voice survives only through the lens of her enemies, Qing officials, foreign sailors, and later European observers. But what little we know is enough to build the silhouette of a titan. She wasn't just a woman who broke the mold. She was a woman who never cared it existed. Junji Sao didn't need the world's permission to become powerful. She took power, wielded it with precision, and vanished into history with more wealth, authority, and dignity than any pirate, male or female, before or after. She didn't fade. She was erased, but legends, as always, find their way back. Zheng Yao didn't wear a crown. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from a throne or royal blood. It came from command, from respect, from fear, from thousands of voices shouting her orders across the waves. In every real sense of the word, she was a queen, a monarch of a kingdom without borders, flags, or fixed territory. Her domain was the South China Sea, and her reach stretched from the Gulf of Tonkin to the shores of Guangdong. She built something no one had before or since. Her pirate confederation was not just criminal. It was political, organized, functioning. She controlled trade routes, established codes of law, negotiated treaties, and enforced order across a region that even the Qing Empire struggled to govern. Her ships weren't scattered raiders. They were fleets. Her captains weren't freelancers. They were officers. Her people weren't rogues. They were citizens of a floating nation. And yet, what makes her legacy truly unmatched is not just her rise, but her exit. Most pirate stories end in fire and rope. Zheng Sao ended in negotiation, retirement, and wealth. She didn't go down with her ship. She stepped off it, unscathed, unbowed, and still holding the purse strings. By the time she died in 1844, she had done what no pirate, no emperor, no general had done before. She walked away from absolute power by choice and kept her legend intact. Today, few monuments bear her name. No palace, no statue in the square, but her presence haunts the South China Sea like a storm cloud that never left, in the whispers of sailors, in the ink of rebel women, in the hearts of those who understand that leadership is not about birthright, but about will. Zheng Yao was proof that greatness doesn't ask permission, that even in a world built to silence women, one voice, sharp, strategic, and unyielding, can command an empire. She ruled without apology. She fought without hesitation. And she retired without defeat. Not a myth, not a legend, but a woman who conquered the sea, and walked away before it could take her. Her sails are gone, but her shadow still stretches across the waves.